Good evening. Our speaker today is Georgia State Senator Julian Bond. Before asking him to come to the podium, I would like to read a few things from the record, so to speak. Julian Bond was born in Nashville, Tennessee on January 14, 1940. While attending Morehouse College in Atlanta, he became active in the civil rights movement of the South, helping found the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Bond was elected in 1965 to the Georgia House of Representatives, but was barred from taking his seat by legislators who objected to his statements on the Vietnam War. Despite winning 2 special elections in 1966, he still did not take his seat until 1967, after a U.S. Supreme Court decision that the Georgia legislature had erred and had made a mistake in refusing him his place. He eventually served 4 terms in the House, and in November 1974 was elected to the state Senate, where he now serves. Bond was co-chairperson of the Georgia Loyal National Democratic Delegation and Insurgent Group at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. The Loyal Democrats were successful in unseating the regular, hand-picked Georgia delegation. Bond was nominated for vice president, but withdrew his name from consideration because of his age. Julian Bond serves on the board of directors of the Delta Ministry Project of the National Council of Churches, the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Fund, the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Social Change, the Center for Community Change, the Highlander Research and Education Center, the National Sharecroppers Fund, the Southern Regional Council, the New Democratic Coalition, and the Voter Education Project. He is board chairperson of the Southern Election Fund and president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. He was recently named to Time magazine's 200 Leaders list. His collected speeches have been published under the title, A Time to Speak, A Time to Act. His poems and articles have appeared in Negro Digest, Motive, Rights and Review, Life, Freedom Ways, Ramparts, Beyond the Blues, New Negro Poets, American Negro Poets, the Book of Negro Humor, and elsewhere. Our speaker for the evening, Senator Julian Bond.
Thank you a great deal. It is generally the custom for most speakers to begin by telling the audience what a great pleasure it is to be here. And so it is a great pleasure to be here. It is a pleasure to be here in many different sorts of ways, not the least of which has to do with my profession. I am by profession a politician. I know that's not a popular profession to be in the United States in 1976. It is nonetheless an important profession. It is the people who do what I do who decide whether or not you will do what you do. It is a rather ancient profession. There are many who believe it to be the world's second oldest profession. And I'm just proud to know that I belong to the finest body of men that money can buy. Now, it is also a custom of most speakers, whether it is a minister in the pulpit on Sunday morning or a lecturer in the college classroom or a politician out on the stump, for the speaker to begin by telling the audience one or more hilarious anecdotes. The purpose of these anecdotes are several-fold. They're intended to put the audience in a good frame of mind, to convince the audience that the speaker's a good person, that he's got a sense of humor just like everyone else, and also to make the speech appear to be longer than it really is. So here is a hilarious anecdote. Before we enter into this period of unrestrained laughter, perhaps I might say that because my profession is the unfair butt of so much low humor, I like to tell hilarious anecdotes that reflect badly on other people's professions. There was this doctor who died and uncharacteristically went to heaven. When he approached the pearly gates, he saw there was a long line of supplicants and applicants there before him. And having been used to special treatment on the earth, he decided he would seek special treatment in heaven too. And so he tried to go to the head of the line, but St. Peter stopped him and said, "No, this is an egalitarian society here. You've got to wait your turn." So he went back to the end of the line. He waited for 15 minutes and half an hour, and finally an hour had passed. The line didn't seem to be moving at all. And so once again, he went up to the head, and once again, St. Peter stopped him when all of a sudden he spied a young man with the kind of short white jacket that doctors often wear, with a stethoscope around his neck and tongue depressors in his pocket. And this young man was just going in and out and in and out as often as he pleased. The doctor became incensed. He said to St. Peter, "I'm a doctor and you don't seem to be able to let me in. And that young man is a doctor and he's going in and out just as often as he pleases. Why does this discrimination exist?" St. Peter said, "You don't understand. That young man isn't a doctor. That's God. He just likes to play doctor now and then." Well, I know you didn't expect Richard Pryor. I want to talk about many different things: the past, the present, and particularly, since we're in the bicentennial period when people look back in order to have something to look forward to, the future. Now, it's a rather difficult prospect to talk about the future. None of us knows with any real certainty what even the next 5 or 10 minutes may bring. The people who talk about the future in the United States have now become so numerous that they constitute a profession all their own. They call themselves futurists, and within this profession have even developed their own language. They discuss the future in terms of the post-industrial, post-scarcity, super-industrial, globally homeopathic, post-affluent, prefigurative society that may, they say, someday be upon us. They construct models of what this future may be like through what they call trend extrapolation, cross-impact analysis, mutual causal paradigms, transformational matrices, all of them predicted on resometrics, technotronics, synergetics, or anticipatory democracy constructed within either macro or micro systems. This means that things are going to change. Within the relatively short span of only 25 years, the population of the world may be as many as 6 billion people. We may by then have developed the ability to recreate ourselves through genetic engineering, to create a race of women and men less hostile to each other than we are, less selfish of their own resources. We may by then have developed the ability to alter our weather as well as our consciousness, within only 3 relatively short years, 50% of the world's population will be reachable by television, and 50% of the world's goods and services will be produced by multinational corporations. We are changing at the same time from an industrial economy into a service economy, an economy in which service availability and informational availability will quickly become the currency of the future. We are sure finally to go through a series of both violent as well as nonviolent wars of redistribution, much like the current crisis over who can charge how much for oil. Now, none of us can plot or plan the future unless we are able to know the past and describe with some specificity the present. We are standing now on the eve of our 200th birthday as an organized people, many of us afraid of what the future may bring, afraid to look too critically at our past, afraid to assign guilt and responsibility for our common condition. 200 years ago, on the 4th of July, the people of the original 13 colonies declared that the economic slavery imposed upon them by British colonialism had denied them their right to life, to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. From that moment on, the first American Revolution had begun. Sadly enough, it automatically excluded great portions of the population from the democratic vision of what the United States of America ought to be. It automatically excluded all women. It automatically excluded Native Americans. And it automatically excluded African Americans, a people kidnapped from their homelands, brought to this country as slaves, their families destroyed, their labor exploited, their humanity denied, and their religion suppressed. Now 200 rather rapid years have gone by. Years of great struggle punctuated in half by civil war and more recently by nonviolent movement. In this period, the original 13 colonies have turned into a great international colossus, a power which now threatens its own citizens with intolerable economic hardship, with social disintegration, and with a continual denial of political rights. Now, while the nation prepares to parade and to celebrate its 200th anniversary, a large and growing American underclass still waits for its own Declaration of Independence to take effect. Within this 200-year context, the peculiar struggle of black people came to some climax over the last 20 years, 2 decades of legal struggles in the courts, complemented by other kinds of struggles in the streets. During this period, we won great victories at lunch counters, at movie theaters, at polling places, at bus stations, and the fabric of legal apartheid in the United States began to be destroyed. What had begun primarily as a movement for civil rights has now become largely a political and an economic movement. And black women and men are winning public office and power in numbers rarely dreamed of before. But despite a 10-year increase of about 150% in the number of black people holding public office, despite the ability we've now got to sit and eat and ride and vote in places that formerly lacked black faces, in a very real way, in 1976, we find our condition unchanged. a quick look at every statistic that measures either how well or how poorly a group of people are doing, the kinds of figures that measure infant mortality, median family income, life expectancy, these will show that while our general condition has improved a great deal, our relative condition has actually managed to get worse. It is almost as though we were climbing a molasses mountain dressed in snowshoes, while everyone else rides a rather rapid ski lift to the top. Now the ski slopes are more treacherous, the molasses melting into mud, a Sargasso sea of crime in high places, of joblessness for many, and hopelessness for many more. Many of the gains won on yesterday now stand suspect. The bus front seat loses meaning for people whose longest trip is likely to be from the feudal system of the rural South to the more mechanized, high-rise poverty of the North. The right to register, the right to vote, these may lose meaning for people forced to choose between Tweedledum and Tweedledee. The classic struggles of the 1960s were carried forward against discrimination in housing, in employment, in education, and in government, both because the victims became their own best champions and because they found a sympathetic ear in the national body politic. But as the demands of the 1960s became more insistent, as a foreign war began to drain our treasury and young manhood, as our best and our brightest were beaten down by bullets, a shift began to occur in the national consciousness. And so, despite a decade and a half of protest and movement, despite election, agitation, and resignation, what has occurred in the United States over the last half-decade is rather simple. The reins of our national government have been seized by a massive coalition of the comfortable, the callous, and the smug, who've closed their hearts, their minds, and their ranks to the claims and calls to conscience put forward by the forgotten and unrepresented elements in American society. Quite naturally, this has resulted in the national nullification of the needs of the needy, the gratuitous gratification of the gross and the greedy, a victory for the politics of penuriousness, prevarication, impropriety, pious platitudes, and self-righteous swinishness. The two most recent presidential elections in 1968 and 1972 gave this group rather frightening power. The second of these more a rout than an election, a rout which reinstalled the fiscal fascists, the merciless merchants of the cost accounting school of social welfarism in the White House, and ensured a 4-year reign for men with an arrogant contempt for people and their problems. The late American folk singer Woody Guthrie once said that some men kill with bullets, others kill with the stroke of a pen. The frightening legislative results of the last half-decade, fostered by an impotent Congress, a Congress unable to resist presidential vetoes, impoundments, cutbacks, shifts in sharing, and reverses in revenue, all these have cut sharpest at the people at the bottom, those who traditionally look to their government for some help. Now, for a short time at the beginning of last year, you may recall, a portion of this trend of legislative powerlessness began to reverse itself. The normally moribund Congress, wet by Watergate and splashes from the tidal basin, made bold by the sight of one of their own ogling bare breast in Boston, moved with some swiftness to topple a series of octogenarians made strong by the senility system and advance the democratic process by opening their own processes to fuller and more public participation. But still, in spite of rising prices and unemployment, in spite of increased inflation and the dangers of recession, these same members of the Congress have demonstrated time and time again they lack the testicular fortitude to offer any alternative to the President's program of promoting austerity by making the poor pay more for food stamps and gas, and by refusing a decent raise in Social Security. But if the years before, the Kennedy and the Johnson years, have taught us any kind of lesson at all, it ought to have been that our government, under militant and concerted pressure, would move slowly and rather ponderously, all too often with all deliberate lack of speed, to become a limited partner of sorts with the American underclass in their struggle to do better for themselves. The last few years have changed all that. The government's attitude toward the poor has changed from benign concern to malignant neglect. Now, in the 10 years of the 1960s, the number of people living in poverty in the United States as defined by government statistic was reduced by nearly 1/3. It's not at all unreasonable to believe that some of these gains were achieved by the Great Society and New Frontier programs of that era. Yet despite these undeniable successes, the cruel and callous castrators moved with cold calculation to kill, freeze, and wind down urban renewal, model cities, community action, public service employment, student loans, public housing, federal impact funds for education, and to impose a 60% national pullback in social services. If we are to believe then with Thomas Jefferson that the common man is the most precious portion of the state, we find that precious resource in real danger of economic extinction today. Human problems are now placed on a balance sheet and forced to add up, to pay profit for themselves. The new administrators in Washington run the programs they direct with all the solicitude of a hungry mortician at an old folks' home. Now, while many of the people of the United States were waltzing into the 1970s, believing that their black problem had either been burned or blown away, infant mortality rates for us remain twice as high as for anyone else. Nearly half of all the black families in the United States earned less than $5,000 a year. The average black American male was dying 7 years earlier than his white counterpart. We remained the last to be hired, the first to be fired. We have reached this peculiar and precarious position because of a series of events of the 1960s. The nonviolent and, in retrospect, lovable marchers of the first part of the decade began to be replaced, if not in fact, then certainly in the public fancy, by the rapacious rioters of the latter part of the 60s. America's larger cities were thought to be either in flames, under martial law, or sinking under the dead weight of a population of pensioners, the unemployed young, or their presumably unemployable parents. The middle mind of America was running away from social concerns in a crisis state all their own. They quite rightly perceived that their taxes, much higher proportionately than those paid by their pernicious president in the past, were escalating to pay for barely maintaining what they were running away from. But they were wrongly taught by their president and others that their taxes were high because of the lazy poor and not because of the corporate evader or the military glutton. The often repeated connection then between today's dilemma and the end of the Reconstruction era 100 years ago is more than frightening. Then and now, a president desperate for power entered into an illicit arrangement, not just with the unreconstructed South, but with the national unreconstructed mentality that believed then, as it does now, that private profit and public arrogance could be pursued at the expense of the people living on the American margin. Concurrently, many of the formerly liberal crusaders for social justice and democracy became tired or involved in other less traumatic concerns. For many of them, picking up beer cans by the side of the highway became an acceptable substitute to winning jobs for black people in the brewery. The aspirations of and movement by black people began to be curtailed, not by organized violence or barbarity, but by a series of nationally choreographed legal and extra-legal maneuvers designed to make us less than political and economic equals. The frenetic and often frantic activity of the 1960s had created a political climate characterized by selfishness and fear. A political constituency was recruited from the frightened to form solid ranks against the forgotten. Backlash is too hackneyed a term for people confused by long hair, frightened by clenched fist, their politics misdirected by those who verbally oppose crime in the streets and who are caught secretly practicing crime in the suites. This massive manipulation of the American mind has made the mundane magnificent and placed government in the hands of men who believe in privilege for the powerful and neglect of the powerless. There can then be no better prescription for relieving this crisis or for reviving some interest in it than by creating a national coalition of need, of parents who want care and instruction, not just warehousing for their children, of workers who want work at a decent and protected wage, of all of those people who work for their living but can't live on what they make, as well as those who can't find work and can't live on what we so grudgingly give, of all those who want an end to welfare and capitalism for the poor, and subsidy and socialism for the wealthy, and who must learn that sufficiency for those at the bottom is compatible with stability for those in the middle. All of those people now live in America, divided now by race and class, fearful of each other, contentious, and impotent. A massive political movement came to near maturity in the United States in the 1960s. Fueled by the fire from the Southern civil rights and national anti-war movements, it threatened to challenge the foundation of the racial and economic arrogance that has drained our treasury and young manhood and created vast reservations of the unwanted on this country's soil. That movement became the partial victim of its own success. It fought for and won the right to sit in the front of the bus, to cast a vote, to sit at a lunch counter. It helped to launch a Southern black political movement, but it failed to sustain and extend itself, and instead saw itself dissipated by struggles on the edge. For many of us, being black became a rhetorical or a sartorial accomplishment. For many others, social commitment began to be measured by the length of your hair or the trickiness of your handshake. Many of the young people who on yesterday were seen marching militantly in the streets are now found running nude on the college grounds, attempting to prove with small success that all men are not created equal. Instead, the political process ought be put to a more stringent test, not as an election day effort alone, but as another weapon in an arsenal that has always contained more pop guns than howitzers. It is rather easily ascertained in the bicentennial year that we have been for 200 years the victims of the philosophy of ethnic purity, of those who believe that black people who arrived in America the year before the Mayflower did somehow have come to constitute an alien group. These master race theories have consigned us to second-class citizenship, to second-best lives, and make our intelligent participation in the citizenship process all the more important now. It is coming to a rather rapid climax this year with the selection process for choosing a new president of the United States. Prior to that selection, there ought to have been developed a rational basis for choosing among the very dozens who offer themselves as candidates. That in turn would have meant the construction among like-minded people of a national movement which would have insisted on certain basic themes that ought to have been adopted by a candidate acceptable to us. These hold the promise of no perfect world, but do hold out the hope that we may Du Bois, who said almost 50 years ago, "What will be, no one knows. It may be a great physical segregation of the world along the color line. It may be an economic rebirth which ensures spiritual and group integrity and physical diversity. It may be utter annihilation of class and race and color barriers in one ultimate mankind, differentiated by talent, susceptibility, and gift. But any of these ends are matters of long centuries and not years. We live in years, swift, flying, transient years. You hold the possible future in your hands, not by wish or will, only by thought, plan, and organization. Thank you. Thank you a great deal. Now we are to have the question and answer period. You ask the questions and I'll give the answers. Yes, sir.
My first question is, do you believe? Now, my second question is, do you believe that black and white people should work together for the betterment of the poor people, black and white?
I think so. It's been true in the past. It's less so in the present. But I think it's a theoretical possibility for the future. It's in the back. I am supporting the candidate who stands head and shoulders, both literally and politically, above all the other candidates for president, Representative Morris Udall of Arizona. Myself and a select few others. Yes. Well, if I said something insulting to you, I'd hope that I would have the good grace to discover it rather quickly and apologize. I'm awfully sorry. I hope you'll forgive me. But if I said it to you now and then saw you tomorrow morning and said it again, then I saw you tomorrow night and said it a third time, and then I saw you the next morning and said it again, then said I'm awfully sorry, I didn't mean to say it after all, I think you'd have some reason to suspect my sincerity. Ethnic purity is a difficult term for definition. No one knows what it means, I think. It may suggest different things to different people. That didn't bother me quite as much as some of the other phrases which he used, like black intrusion. How many of you have ever intruded? Probably some of you intruding here. Alien group. Does anyone here belong to an alien group? I think it was said deliberately. It was said to curry favor with people on his right. He knew that those people on his left who were with him had already made such a great leap of faith that they could not leap back. And the election returns last night bore him out. So I didn't think much of it, but who am I to say? Yeah. I do and I don't. I would like to be president on the one hand, but I would hate to go through what these other men are going through right now. It just seems all out of proportion to the worth of the job. Of all the people who have been on the political scene the last 2 years, I think the one that ought to draw the most admiration is Senator Mondale, who said the middle of last year that he did not want to spend the next 2 years of his life in Holiday Inns. I spend 60 days a year in Holiday Inns, and I know what that's like already, and I don't have any great desire to spend another 300 additional days doing it. Yes, sir. I don't think Governor Wallace has any future in national politics. This has been his wheelchair has been his Waterloo. And I think if, in retrospect, you might have assumed that he would do poorly in 1976 because of the accident, and for no other reason, I should think, or because of the assassination attempt on him. Someone advanced the theory to me that people who hate black people, who hate Jews, who hate Catholics, also hate handicapped people. Why is Udall opposed to the idea of scatter site housing? I don't know. I think it's a mistake on his part. He and Senator Jackson, Governor Carter, President Ford, and Ronald Reagan all agree on that issue. I don't know why he opposed it. Probably because he represents Tucson, and people in the Tucson suburbs are not looking forward to the idea of the people who are now living in downtown Tucson living with them. But I really don't know why he opposes scattered site housing. The bill you refer to is SB 1, Senate Bill 1, which is a recodification of the Federal Criminal Code, but also in the process includes putting into federal law some sanctions which are not now part of that law. It would, in effect, make legal the illegalities of the Nixon-Mitchell years. And I'm not really sure what the current status of the bill is. It is in the process of being amended, which is tragic in a way because many of the Senate liberals who oppose it may well vote for it if they think some of the most objectionable features in it are removed. The better part of wisdom, I would think, would be to defeat it entirely and to begin this process all over again because the recodification of the code is very badly needed. What isn't needed is these additions and changes that have been put into it. Well, from my present position as a professional politician in the Georgia State Senate, I actually do not expect to have much dent on the unemployment problem at all, primarily because I think it's a national problem and there's little or nothing we are able or willing or capable of doing in the state of Georgia to put much of a real dent in the unemployment picture nationally. Were I in a position to have some influence on the national scene, there are a couple of things I would do. For a short range, as a short range proposition, I think you've got to develop a processes, something like that in the Humphrey Hawkins bill, through which the government becomes the guarantor of employment as an employer of last result, while at the same time private industry is given some incentives, probably through a tax scheme, to hire the unemployed and put them into some gainful long-term employment. Over the longer run, you've got to find some way to make our economy fuel up again, much as it was during the middle of the 1960s. And then it was because of the ongoing war in Vietnam. Now, we either have several options. We could attack some other small, helpless nation, or we could begin to cut part of the expenditures we spend for, I forget the economist's phrase, but for labor. We could cut some of the spending we're now doing, which does not produce as many jobs as it might, and increase spending in other areas that are more labor-intensive or job-productive, such as in housing, construction, and so on, where the spin-out effect goes to many, where the dollar goes into many, many different pockets, rather than in the military, where it goes into some few and then stops. Well, I was very taken by Secretary Kissinger's speech the other day. I'd just like to be even more taken by his words and his deeds, as opposed to just his words. I thought the speech was fine, but the history of the United States in speaking in favor of majority rule in Southern Africa and in acting covertly to ensure minority rule in Southern Africa is a rather long one. So I would like to see some deeds back up those words. I would like to see us more heavily involved in seeking a solution to the problem of these two, this last great dictatorship and totalitarian government in South Africa.
Besides education, what experiences would you suggest for young Black people who are interested in becoming strong leaders?
Well, I think unfortunately, there isn't a school for leaders one can attend, and if there were, it probably wouldn't be a very good one. Its graduates would always be suspect. But I think you aspire to leadership by developing something both within yourself as well as developing capabilities which you use outside of yourself. Part of that is done in the formal educational process, and another part of it is done in an informal process aside from the reading and writing and arithmetic and books that you learn in school. And it involves being involved in projects with people where if your ideas are well developed and will advance a common cause, then you will naturally become a person in some leadership, depending also on whether or not you have a rather largely developed ego and believe that it is ordained for you to have done this. So I would advise people who want to aspire to positions of leadership to put themselves into positions where leadership is called for, which can really be found in and out of school and wherever they happen to be, whatever their choice of job in life may happen to be. Yes, sir. Well, to the good, he reorganized our state government. We had a cumbersome and overburdened bureaucracy with many competing branches or many agencies which in essence did the same sort of thing, and he streamlined that from around 200 plus to a few more than 30, if I'm not mistaken. He sadly enough, not from my point of view, but rather than decreasing the number of state employees, actually increased it. So our government's more efficient now. It's also more expensive now, which may be the price one pays in the modern age for efficiency. He appointed 40 plus black people to boards and commissions where none had served before. He had a special interest in special education for the handicapped, to his credit. But the major success of his administration was his reorganization plan. As for failures, he had a little difficulty in getting along with members of the legislature, not on questions of principle, where honest men understand disagreement, but often we felt on arbitrary and capricious matters of wanting his own way. He, from my own very personal point of view, expressed opinions on some rather larger national issues that I found reprehensible at the time, and I don't know if he still holds these views today, or in fact what his views are today. But as a governor, I would say he was better than fair.
What would be a suggestion in the South African Asian
For the United States, or for?
your suggestions to the American about the racial war in South Africa, Rhodesia, and Namibia?
Well, take one at a time. Take the Republic of South Africa. I think the United States would be well guided to do two things: to follow the recommendations made by Secretary Kissinger, as well as to implement some actions that private citizens themselves can do. For example, in my view, South Africa is an outlaw nation, and its representatives ought not be allowed commerce with civilized human beings. And there's one right there. Secondarily, I think the United States government ought to insist that those American firms which do business in the Republic of South Africa, as well as those that do business elsewhere around the globe, ought to have to adhere to the same sorts of anti-discrimination laws in their host countries that they do here, and that no business which allows itself to be governed by laws which are in contradiction to the laws of the United States ought to be allowed an export license or ought to be allowed to do business with the support and guarantees of the United States government outside of our borders. Additionally, I think Americans can begin to look carefully at the South African products that come into this country, lobster for one. There was a strong movement at one time when Portugal was the one remaining colonial power in Africa to make sure that Portuguese products weren't sold in some sections of the country. There's great resistance to that among certain sections of the population who were overly fond of Mateus Rosé, including many here, I imagine. But I think private citizens have got to find ways to impress upon our government that this is a matter of great concern to us, because although I do think it's a matter of concern to many Americans, I don't think the government thinks it is, and I don't think it's of concern to as many of us as it ought to be. Well, if you look at the level of poverty when we started 5 years ago and the level of poverty now, you could say we're a failure. There are more people out of work. Things are worse. But we didn't think when we began that we would redress the governmentally sponsored or historically developed differences between the very poor and the very wealthy in the South. We did think we could help establish a legal basis by which people whose condition exists because of their poverty could find some means of redress. And in that latter sense, I think we've been rather successful. We've established the non-right of the government to sterilize people against their will. We have established as one of several legal precedents the right of a woman to defend herself against a sexual assault, even at the cost of taking her attacker's life. We are now engaged in 2 assaults on the capital punishment statutes of Georgia and Louisiana, which, as you might imagine, disproportionately affect poor people. So in that sense, we have been rather successful in redressing the big difference between the well-to-do and the poorer classes in the South. We have had almost no success at all. Yes.
If you were to run for president, would you eventually choose a woman as your running mate?
I once thought that in view of the historic allegiance of the Democratic Party to the balanced ticket, that were I the presidential nominee, and being a 36-year-old black Southeasterner, that I'd have to have a middle-aged or older white Northwesterner, probably one of rather diverse ethnic background and belonging to a faith not mine. But since then, I have rejected that as pandering to special interest groups, women and Baptists. I think those groups would be insulted by such overt attempts to solicit their vote. So I would just flip a coin or throw a straw into the crowd, and whoever caught it would do it, because that's all it takes to be vice president, the ability to... I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Well, first, I don't like to talk about roles. Actors have roles. People, although many people do play roles and parts. Well, the bicentennial is a fact. I don't think anything we're going to do is going to stop it or advance it or make it go forward or backward. And it's like any other birthday celebration. If you believe your 200th birthday celebration is a happy one, then you should have a party and exchange gifts, and people come and sing around your cake. If you think not, then perhaps you ought to engage in some sober reflection. Look back over these 200 years. Why has this happened? Why particularly has it happened to me? Is it something I said? You should look back over the 200 years and see if you can learn some lessons to prevent this from happening over the next 200 years. That's what I think we really ought to be doing, is using this opportunity to first look at ourselves and our past. We have a 200-year history, 200-plus year history in this country. And we ought to take this occasion to examine it and find out how to keep it from happening again. Yes. Well, I wouldn't have said that that was the reason why to begin with, although that's a factor in some of the things which they do. I think the FBI and the Chicago police conspired to murder and infiltrate, and not just the Chicago police, but police forces all over the country, did because that is of their nature. It's generic. It's some people drink to excess, other people kill. It's built into them. And I don't mean that in order to be a Chicago policeman, you must have a predisposition to kill. But part of the nature of the job in the middle 1960s was to have that predisposition. It comes with the territory. It's like being a traveling salesman. It's part of living in the United States in the middle 1960s. That was endemic to it. It was part of it. It's inescapable. Built into the economy, built into the society. It's almost inevitable that it happened, I think. Almost unpreventable that it would occur. The Georgia legislature refused to seat me because they objected to a statement I had endorsed on the war, and it was a statement which now would sound very mild, but in 1966 sounded rather extreme, and they thought it was treasonous and seditious, and that it was impossible for me to believe in this statement and at the same time swear allegiance to the constitutions of the state of Georgia and the United States, and so they didn't let me take my seat, but I filed suit, and the good Supreme Court that we used to have ruled in my favor. I would hate to have to go before these 9 men now. To have 1 or 2, yes. I really don't. Well, I know where Rob Brown is, and Stokely is still traveling around as I do, you know, saying some things he used to say and some things that he never did say. I don't know what the possibility is of developing another national movement. I think it'd be rather slim. There are no troops for such a movement. And to say that there are no leaders for it is to misread what it was about then, because it had no leaders then. It was a near spontaneous eruption of young people who did not look for direction, who did not ask questions about what should we do, who did not seek to have answers delivered to them, but who out of their own minds and hearts discovered for themselves what ought to be done. We're in a very different time now. I don't think there are troops for such a movement. I don't think there's any sympathy for such a movement. I don't think there's any impetus for such a movement. Here we are living in a time where there are more black people out of work than any time since the Great Depression, and fewer of us prepared to do anything at all about it, including most of the people here, including the majority of the people here, including all the people here. So I just don't think there's much of an option for it. And the whole debate about whether to be in the system or out of the system, who's not in? Who is not in? We're all of you, born into it, and the only way you get out of it is to die or to leave the country. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us specifically why you refused to endorse Jimmy Carter?
Well, first, I don't like him. I think he's a right-winger, and secondly, he and I are involved in a little personal dispute, and this began before the whole ethnic purity thing. I mean, that's sufficient in and of itself right there, unless you are the kind of person that has the Christian compassion to forgive and forget, the love that heals. But he and I are involved in a personal dispute in which he's called me a liar and I've called him a liar. It's about a matter that only the two of us know the truth of. Only he and I know that one of us is telling the truth and one of us is telling a lie. And he can't tell a lie. And my word is my bond. And I cannot conceive in my mind of the circumstance in which I would cast a vote for him. I cannot conceive of a circumstance in which I would cast a vote for him. Yes.
What do you think the situation in Boston, do you have a support busing?
Well, I support busing as a general proposition. I was bused to school when I was younger, partly because I lived in a rural part of the United States, and partly because that was the way in which black children where I lived got to school. They went on the bus. White children walked because they lived near their school. They went to a neighborhood school. We went to a school in a large neighborhood covering several square miles. But I don't have any real objection to busing. What's happening in Boston, I think, may be incurable because it is a result of a series of decisions made by the local police force to tolerate certain kinds of antisocial behavior and not to tolerate others. And they have created a climate of lawlessness in a portion of the population which believes not only that the Boston police tolerate their behavior, and they do, but also that the President of the United States is their close friend and associate. So it may be beyond redemption, but I would think the application of a little good old law and order up there would quickly bring people to their senses. I didn't say it was a good system. One of the reasons people like you are in it is because you're waiting for somebody to come along and tell you how to get out of it. And you're going to be waiting an awful long time. Now, you have within yourself, I think, the intelligence and the ability to formulate your own notions of what ought to be done to improve things in this country. But if you're waiting for a knight on a white horse or on a black horse to come along and say, follow me, you're going to be sitting and waiting a long time.
Some months ago on the Reasoner Report, you talked about running for president. Since you didn't do this, what do you plan to do now?
Just to run for re-election to the state senate right now. I couldn't raise the money to run for president. Many of the people who urged me to do so gave me their vocal support, which was much appreciated, but which wouldn't spend. Yes. Yes. You mean, will I say something about better? Well, one of the ways to guarantee better health care for poor people is to devise a health care system which was dependent not on private insurance companies, as is the proposal, say, put forth by President Nixon and most of the proposal put forth by Senator Kennedy and Congressman Mills, but to devise a health care system which is financed by the National Treasury by a series of non-regressive income taxes of medical treatment, which they now need very badly. There are one or two more. Yes.
A recent Supreme Court decision in the state of Virginia that allowed morality to be legislated. This seems to me will be to allow elimination of laws that can be selectively enforced to suppress resistant people. I haven't heard a great deal of yelling about this by leaders of the nation who seem to think this is a cause. Why is that?
I really don't know. I have heard some people whom I did not expect to speak out against the Supreme Court's ruling in the case you referred to, much to my great surprise. I'm trying to think of some very rather conservative newspaper columnist whose name escapes me at the moment, who was horrified by it, as I think were many, many others. Part of the reason I think more people didn't speak out against it is because it involved a case involving homosexuals, and that's a taboo subject for many people in high public office to discuss. They'd rather not associate themselves with anything favorable to homosexuals. But I think you're right, but it's not just this most recent ruling. It's a whole series of things been going on for many, many years, which would lead you to believe that the government will try to publicly legislate private morality or private behavior, not just private sexual behavior, but private and public political behavior as well. It has done so in the past and is sure to do so in the future, because few, if any, hands will be raised to say a nay. They'll all be waiting for some instruction. Thank you.